Have you ever prayed quietly about something so frightening that the prayer itself came out sounding less like trust and more like trying to talk yourself out of a panic attack? Maybe your words were technically aimed at God, but underneath them was a desperate need to just make the fear stop, more than an actual reaching toward His presence. Maybe you prayed the same anxious request 5 times in 10 minutes, each repetition a little more frantic than the last. Or maybe nothing felt frantic on the outside at all. Your voice stayed calm, your hands stayed folded. But underneath the composed words was a quiet scramble to control an outcome you were terrified of losing. Here's what most believers are never taught. Not every prayer that sounds urgent is actually faith. Fear can borrow the exact same words, the exact same posture, even the exact same tears, and still be driven by something completely different underneath. The outward shape of the prayer tells you almost nothing about which one is actually steering it. It's not that fear itself is sinful, and it's not that bringing your fear to God is wrong. Fear brought honestly to God is still faith in motion. But there are specific prayers where fear has quietly taken the steering wheel, while faith just sits in the passenger seat, saying nothing. Most of us were taught to bring our fears to God, but never taught to notice when a fear-driven prayer has stopped reaching toward Him and started simply trying to manage the terror on its own. The line between the two can be almost invisible from the inside, which is exactly why it's worth learning to see. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly 5 prayers you must never pray out of fear instead of faith. So the next time panic rises, you'll know how to bring it to God instead of just performing it in His direction. None of these 5 are about shaming yourself for feeling afraid or pretending fear doesn't belong in prayer at all. They're about recognizing the specific moments where fear quietly hijacks a prayer's direction. Let's start with the one that's easiest to mistake for genuine faith, and move toward the one that's hardest to recognize once you're already deep inside it. The first prayer you must never pray out of fear is the prayer that bargains with God to make the fear go away, rather than actually bringing the fear to Him. This often shows up as a kind of negotiation. God, if you just take this feeling away, I'll do anything, spoken less as genuine surrender and more as a desperate attempt to strike a deal that ends the discomfort as quickly as possible. There's a meaningful biblical difference between asking God for peace and demanding that He immediately remove every uncomfortable feeling, since peace is often described as something that guards the heart in the midst of a trial, not something that erases the trial itself before you're willing to sit in it for even a moment. A bargaining prayer wants the feeling gone. A faith-filled prayer is willing to be present with God inside the feeling. Practically, this might sound like promising God a list of changed behaviors in exchange for the anxiety lifting immediately, or repeating, "Just make this fear stop," over and over without ever actually naming what you're afraid of to Him directly. It can also look like bargaining for a specific timeline, as if God simply needed the right incentive to move faster. A short reflection: try replacing "make this feeling go away completely" with "be with me inside this feeling." And notice how different the prayer becomes when it stops trying to escape and starts actually inviting God in. But the next prayer is even harder to recognize, because it sounds remarkably reasonable. The second prayer you must never pray out of fear is the prayer that tries to control every possible outcome instead of trusting God with the one outcome you can't predict. This often shows up as an exhausting mental checklist, disguised as prayer, covering every conceivable scenario, every possible way things could go wrong, as if naming each fear out loud were the same thing as protecting yourself from it. The list rarely feels complete, because fear can always imagine one more scenario worth covering. There's an important biblical distinction between bringing your request to God with thanksgiving and trying to pray your way into controlling every variable, since genuine trust eventually releases the outcome, while fear-driven prayer keeps reaching for the steering wheel, even while the hands are folded. The posture says surrender. The content is still gripping tightly. You can recognize this kind of prayer by how little space it actually leaves for not knowing. Practically, this might sound like praying through every possible diagnosis before a doctor's appointment, covering each one individually, as if exhausting the list could somehow prevent the worst one, or praying about every way a conversation might go wrong before it even happens, rehearsing disaster scenarios under the cover of praying about it. A short reflection: ask yourself honestly, am I bringing this situation to God, or am I trying to pray my way into controlling something that was never going to be controllable in the first place? The difference is whether your hands open or stay clenched by the end of the prayer. If you've ever finished praying feeling far more exhausted than when you started, the next prayer explains exactly why. The third prayer you must never pray out of fear is the prayer that's actually aimed at convincing yourself, more than it's aimed at God. This often shows up as repetition that doesn't feel like communion, saying the same reassuring phrase over and over. Not because you're speaking with God about it, but because you're trying to drown out the fear loud enough that you'll eventually believe your own words. There's a clear biblical pattern of declaring truth as an act of faith. But there's a real difference between declaring truth to God in trust and chanting words at yourself in an attempt to self-soothe, since the first stays relational, while the second quietly turns prayer into a coping mechanism with God's name attached to it. The words can be identical. The direction they're actually traveling is not. One is reaching outward toward a person. The other is circling inward toward your own nervous system. Practically, this might sound like repeating, God is in control, God is in control. God is in control rapidly under your breath, during a panic spiral, with your attention fixed entirely on calming your own nervous system rather than on God himself. Or reciting a memorized prayer on autopilot, purely because the familiar rhythm feels soothing, regardless of whether you're actually present to who you're saying it to. A short reflection, notice where your attention actually goes while you're repeating the words, toward your own racing heart, or toward God's actual presence. Both can start in fear, but only one stays a prayer. The other, however sincere it feels, has quietly become a private conversation with yourself. This next prayer sounds the most spiritual of all five, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. The fourth prayer you must never pray out of fear is the prayer that demands a sign from God because you've decided you can't move forward without absolute certainty first. This often shows up as an ultimatum disguised as devotion. God, if you really love me, show me a clear sign right now. Where the underlying message isn't really trust, but a quiet threat that faith itself is contingent on God performing exactly when and how fear requires. There's an important biblical caution about testing God rather than trusting him, since demanding proof before you're willing to take another step reverses the actual order of faith, which is meant to walk forward into uncertainty trusting God's character, not refuse to move until uncertainty has been completely removed. A sign-demanding prayer treats faith as something owed to you in advance, rather than something exercised in the dark. Real faith and demanded proof rarely arrive in the same prayer at the same time. Practically, this might sound like refusing to make a decision until God sends an unmistakable confirmation, treating ordinary circumstances as either proof or rejection, depending on how convenient they are, or praying, just give me a sign and I'll believe, as if belief were something God still needed to earn from you, rather than something you're being invited to offer him. It can also look like silently setting a deadline for God to respond, and treating silence past that deadline as a final answer, rather than simply more waiting. A short reflection, ask yourself, am I asking for wisdom to move forward, or am I refusing to move at all until fear's exact conditions are met? Wisdom welcomes guidance, fear sets terms. This last prayer is the one that disguises itself most convincingly as spiritual maturity. The fifth and hardest prayer to recognize is the prayer that sounds completely surrendered on the outside, while underneath it you've already quietly decided how God needs to answer in order for you to actually be okay. This one is the hardest to admit because it borrows all the right language. Your will be done. I trust you no matter what. Spoken sincerely, even tearfully, while a hidden condition sits underneath every word, as long as it doesn't go the way I'm most afraid of. The surrender is real on the surface, but it has a locked door fear installed without you noticing. There's a sobering biblical example of surrender that holds even when the outcome remains unknown and frightening, where the prayer, not my will but yours, was spoken honestly in genuine anguish, not after fear's conditions had already been quietly negotiated and approved. True surrender precedes knowing the answer. Fear's version of surrender only shows up once it's already fairly confident which way things are likely to go. Practically, this might sound like praying, I trust you with this diagnosis, while privately having already decided you can only actually handle one specific outcome, or saying your will be done about a relationship, while quietly bracing to fall apart completely if it ends the way you fear most. The words sound like rest. The heart is still negotiating an exit clause. It can also look like avoiding any mental rehearsal of the outcome you fear most, as though refusing to imagine it could somehow keep it from happening. A short reflection. Ask yourself honestly, am I willing to actually mean these words if the answer is the very thing I'm most afraid of? Or am I just hoping God hears the language of surrender and responds the way fear has already decided is acceptable? That answer reveals which one was actually praying. Let's close with a short prayer. God, thank you for letting me bring my fear to you honestly, instead of requiring me to arrive already calm before I'm allowed to speak. Teach me to stop bargaining for the feeling to disappear, and instead let me invite you into the feeling itself. Free me from exhausting myself trying to control every possible outcome, and from repeating words at myself instead of actually speaking to you. Give me the patience to walk forward without demanding signs fear requires before I'll trust you. And give me the courage to mean, your will be done, even when I don't yet know what that will is. Teach me that surrender isn't a strategy for managing fear, but an actual resting place in who you are. Help me recognize, gently and without shame, the exact moment fear starts steering a prayer that was meant to be yours. In Jesus' name, amen. There's one more layer to this we haven't touched yet. What genuine faith sounds like when fear is still present in the room, and we'll get into that next time. If even one of these 5 prayers sounded honestly familiar, you're exactly who this video was made for. Subscribe for more honest Christian wisdom on prayer, fear, and faith that holds even in uncertainty, and comment below which one you've prayed without realizing it. See you in the next video.